first topic I think we should discuss is the amendment the House of Lords made this week to the Brexit bill, which guaranteed the rights of EU nationals living in the UK post-Brexit. What was your take on that, Sam?
The issue surrounding Brexit is that nobody knows what anybody's position is. And I think that this was something that a lot of people, including people who support Brexit, this is something that they support as a policy. I think it's impractical to suggest that we should just send every EU national back to their country, despite some people living here for years, having children here, having children that have been born here. I think it's just ridiculous to think that we could send all of those people back and that not create some form of backlash.
Certainly, having spoken to Brexiters that I know, they were not in the position of wanting to send EU nationals back to their own countries. That was not that bad motivation for voting for Brexit. But I think you're right. I think what strikes me about it is if we're going to have this sort of conversation with the EU where we say, oh, we're going to use the EU citizens as bargaining chips and sort of make sure that, you know, there are leverage in the negotiations, that's only possible if you're seriously prepared to deport 3 million people if you don't get what you want. And not only is that completely inhumane, it's also like completely against our own economic interest, because if we deport 3 million mainly tax-paying EU citizens and then the EU deports 1.2 million mainly pensioners back to the UK, we're going to be massively worse off. So it makes no sense for the government to even pursue that kind of line of argument, and just guaranteeing and keeping the citizens here who we have means that we're better off.
But I would go further than that and say it's completely undoable. The Home Office has not got the resources or the money to deport 3 million people. If you want to talk about saving money, maybe not deporting that amount of people is a good way to start.
We don't know where all the EU citizens are. I think it was an article a while back now that was sort of saying that the government doesn't have all the information to know exactly where all the EU citizens are because they just get national insurance numbers. There's no unique document that they have or way for us to say, oh yeah, you're an EU citizen. It'll be a very laborious process to try and process and find out exactly how many we have and who's where and so on.
It would be virtually, impossible to do. But also, what will we do about children who have been born in Britain, whose parents came from the EU? There are tough decisions like that you either have to separate the two or you have to deport British-born children.
Yeah.
Which just is a ridiculous policy.
Yeah.
And then also the wider issue of how many people move to the EU from Britain to work. Very few. Most people move to Europe to retire. And if we start deporting, let's be honest, our workforce, if we deport a lot of our workforce and send them back to their home countries, then other EU countries are going to deport a lot of our pensioners back over to Britain. And I think that would have a worse impact. It's worth pointing out as well, I do believe that we should have controls on immigration, but the bill that the House of Lords blocked was just unreasonable, unhumane, unworkable, unpractical, and wouldn't even benefit the UK. I don't think there's anybody who sensibly and seriously says that this policy would benefit Britain.
The government says they want to reject this amendment, which the House of Lords has put in the bill. If the Commons now rejects the amendment, should the Lords put it back in again?
This is a slightly different issue, but
yeah, it is.
I want to see. I'm going off on a tangent on your tangent, but I want to see the House of Lords elected. So from my perspective, I would love for the Lords to be as irritating to the Commons as feasibly possible, so that even the Tories say we need to reform the Lords because it's not working. So I think that, one, on this policy issue, the Lords should keep on putting in this amendment. And secondly, from an electoral reform perspective, the Lords should keep on doing their job and holding the Commons to account. And I think if the Lords keep on doing this, we might see, number one, a bad policy not implemented, and number two, we might see actual reform in the House of Lords. So from my perspective, the House of Lords should just keep on submitting this amendment.
It's been really amusing to see Conservatives now decrying the House of Lords for going against them when they have been the stalwart defenders of it for decades, refusing to allow any reform. And now all of a sudden, the House of Lords is terrible because it's stopping their policy from getting through.
But also, some of the MPs seem to think that it's a Tory idea to reform the House of Lords.
Yeah, which is nonsense.
Yes.
They've been the most opposed party to House of Lords reform.
Because in general, it's benefited them quite well.
Well, yeah, because they had a majority until 1997. My concern with the House of Lords at the moment is the Tories won't reform it; they'll just abolish it, and then we'll just have just the Commons with no checks on its power. And I'd rather an unelected House of Lords than nothing at all checking the Commons' power. And I think it's difficult to think about how we would elect the House of Lords. I think it would have to be. I mean, I would say actually, what we should do is the Commons should be elected with PR, but then the House of Lords could be elected via some form of first past the post. And obviously the Lords would still be the very much the subservient house. But I think that might be a good way to compromise.
The main issue with the Lords is that there's so many of them who don't bother turning up to vote. There's very few Lords that actually participate in the system. So what I'd like to see is only have those lords and ladies and whatever that are actually going to participate in voting. So for this Brexit bill, or for the amendment, which is more correct, for that, such a small proportion of people bothered to turn up to actually vote one way or the other for this amendment.
Yeah.
So I think that's a sure sign. When people aren't turning up, some people have never turned up to vote.
There are 804 peers in the House of Lords. And I think on the amendment which passed 358 to 256, that was 600 odd. And that was like the most you get in a vote. That's a high turnout.
That was one of the biggest sort of debates that we've had for a long time. But we're talking about how the whole system of the House of Lords needs changing. But what we've seen over the past week is that the political and moral high ground is currently occupied by a group of unelected people who are only there because they've served their parties diligently for a few years.
Yeah.
That is now the moral high ground in Britain. That's how weird the government's proposals are on Brexit.
Yeah, it is remarkable that it's the House of Lords saying, no, don't do this. This is inhumane to the government.
I mean, what state is Britain in that the House of Lords is now our moral compass?
I don't know. It's got that bad. But I do wonder though, like, I wonder whether the House of Lords will put this amendment back in the bill when they get it back. Because the problem is with this timetable for triggering Article 50, because Theresa May has decided that it must be done by this arbitrary date she set herself, which some people seem to think is March 15th, that she'll try and trigger it. But the issue is, if the government is going to reject the amendment, by the time the bill gets back to the Lords and they vote on it, you're going to be really hard pressed to fulfil the March deadline. And if the Lords then decide to put the amendment back in the bill again, they aren't hitting the deadline, and the Lords can delay the bill for a year if they really want to. So it's interesting to see if the government will give any ground at any point, because if the Lords are going to be really belligerent, string this out with months and months, which would be interesting.
There's two ways. If the Lords do string it out, there's obviously two responses the government has. First one is to surrender some ground and to say, okay, we will accept this amendment. The second one is to launch a tirade of abuse and call every member of the House of Lords an enemy of the British people.
There's a third way. They could just appoint 300 Tory peers.
I wouldn't put that past them either.
I think that's probably the most likely. That's probably the most likely thing they'll do. They'll move to abolish the Lords or whatever, and they'll just appoint 400, however many Tory peers they need, to get a majority and just ram it through. Because the Prime Minister can appoint as many peers as she wants, because it's just the Queen's power, and the Prime Minister just uses that power. Should Corbyn be saying to his lords that they should keep putting this amendment back in the bill?
For the time being, they should, definitely.
Even if it means missing the March deadline. Because that to me, potentially, putting myself in Corbyn's shoes, he's been very keen to make sure that people don't think he's frustrating Brexit. If Labour peers voting for the amendment means that the government misses the deadline in March, that would be really bad for Corbyn, I think, on his own terms.
It's the problem with British democracy at the moment, isn't it? Because this policy, as we both agree, is actually ridiculous. But what we also both agree is that the people voted for Brexit. And how do you get the government to drop this policy and still fulfill the will of the British people and trigger Article 50?
Well, I mean, that's the thing, though. For me, I still think that the best way to articulate it, and maybe a Labour leader who is much better at communication, which we both acknowledge Corbyn is not particularly good at communication. I still think the best way for Labour to have articulated it was vote for the bill at second reading, to say, we are voting to trigger Article 50, we're respecting the will of the people, etc. Vote for your amendments. If you don't get your amendments, vote no at third reading, because then you're saying, yeah, we agree to the principle of triggering Article 50, but we're not just going to write the government a blank check on it. It's one thing to say we're going to trigger Article 50. It's another thing to say, oh yeah, just do whatever you want. There's no restrictions on our end on what you do over the next 2 years in negotiations. That's a really irresponsible position to take, I think. As an opposition, it's your job to hold the government to account.
I believe that the Labour Party is holding the government to account, but at the same time, we have got to leave the European Union. The people have voted. So it is a really hard position to be in, because we don't want to stop Brexit, but we don't want the Tories to have free rein on what their Brexit is.
But I think the thing is with that position is that Corbyn's problem at the moment is with Labour voters. It's people who voted Labour. Like, these people aren't going to be, really inclined to believe the Tories. If Labour could just communicate to them that we're supporting Brexit, we're going to go through a Brexit, but we're not going to give the Tories free rein on everything they do. Surely that's a message that would have resonated with Labour voters, who don't like the Tories.
I think it would initially, but it all depends on how long Labour then continues to delay Brexit.
Well, then Labour would then have to, in my opinion, accuse the government of delaying Brexit, because if the government wouldn't compromise and achieve a national consensus for the country as they say, they want unity. The government say, if the government really wants unity, compromise on us on Article 50, and then we can proceed with Brexit. That's how I'd frame it. I'd then accuse the government of delaying it.
The issue with that is, this is general politics, isn't it? So the government says the opposition's delaying, the opposition says the government's delaying. The major problem that Labour has is that half of the Labour MPs will sacrifice the party just to get rid of the leader. So I don't think Labour will have a coherent voice on Brexit. There's also a lot of anti-Brexit Labour MPs that are trying anything they can to stop Brexit entirely. So there's lots of different opinions and views within the Labour Party, whereas the Tory party acknowledge if they shut up and listen to the leader, then their party looks stronger. And sadly, at the moment, the Labour Party hasn't realised that. And I think it's the Labour infighting that completely undermines its Brexit arguments and weakens its negotiations. There's a quote by a very nice man called Jesus, and Jesus talks about how a kingdom divided on itself cannot stand, and I think that's the position the Labour Party's in right now.
Are you sure that was Jesus?
I think it was Jesus.
Is that a Jesus quote?
I think it's when he's talking about the demons when he removes the demon, and they say that, you're just a demon removing demons, and he says, how can a kingdom stand if it's divided?
Oh,
But I
right.
think that's the Labour Party right now. It's divided in and itself, and it's weakening all the debates. So I think all the wings of the party need to accept Jeremy Corbyn's won 2 leadership elections, and they should support him now so that we can get the best deal for Brexit.
So just over a week ago now, we had 2 by-elections, both in Stoke and Copeland. I think you were going to introduce this, weren't you?
Yeah, well, not so much an introduction to this topic, more I want to relay once again my disdain. Because these 2 by-elections that we've just had were quite expensive by-elections. And the main thing about these by-elections is that we didn't need them. There was no reason to have these by-elections.
This is what you said
There was,
on the first Politalk podcast.
yes, where
Yes.
nobody's died, nobody's seriously injured. It's just 2 people who want a better job. And I think if you're elected to serve a 5-year term, there should be a good reason why you haven't served a 5-year term. So the first thing I just want to say is that we're going to be talking about 2 by-elections that should never have happened.
Yeah. I think if we start with the good news, start with the Stoke by-election, I guess. I said I'm pretty sure I said on the first Politalk that if Labour couldn't win if UKIP couldn't win in Stoke, they can't win anywhere, and I stand by that. I think they are just incapable of winning elections.
Well, I certainly think this proves that UKIP is not the threat that everybody thought it was.
Yeah.
I mean, Stoke is the most Brexit place in Britain. UKIP stood their own national leader. This is happening post-Brexit, whilst Theresa May is, not delivering Brexit quick enough for most Brexit. This was against a Remainer who was very active on social media talking about how he hated Remain. And UKIP increased their percentage of votes by 2%.
Yeah. And still lost. Staggering.
If they can't win here, it does make you think, where can they win?
They can't. And there's 2 elements to this. One, as you were saying, UKIP isn't a threat. It's not a threat to Labour in the North. UKIP are not about to start winning Labour seats, but for a few reasons. One, they're such clowns. Like, the whole by-election was just headlines about Paul Nuttall and how he cannot stop lying about literally everything. There were so many claims he made that turned out to be false. And the second part of it is UKIP. They're so disorganised. They
can't campaign.
They haven't got any money. They seem to have no idea how to run a proper campaign. They've got a leader who's a complete clown. They've got constant infighting. Like, they're trying to kick out their only MP. The party is trying to kick out their only elected MP, the only person who could actually win an election as a UKIP member. They want to expel them from the party. It's crazy. But the second part of it is Labour are still under threat in the North because the Conservatives are a threat in the North now. I think viably, because there are people who are moving away from Labour. They're just not going to UKIP. They're going to the Tories.
As it's transpired, what we've seen is that UKIP gained a fairly significant proportion of votes as a protest party. But when it comes down to actually establishing themselves as a major political force, when it comes down to actually starting to campaign, when it comes down to organising a campaign, they can't do it. It seemed to me like all UKIP did was post leaflets and pay for leaflets to be delivered and knock on random doors.
And urinate up someone's house and then try and force their way in.
Yes, that was particularly amazingly bad. But they don't seem to have any campaign strategies. They would just knock on random doors, and I don't think they, wrote down how people were voting. I don't think they knew who lived in what address. I don't think they had any idea of how you run a campaign.
It's because they expected to win. The headlines, the noises from UKIP's camp, even right at the start of the by-election campaign, were, "Yeah, we're going to win. We're going to take Stoke. Like, it's Brexit central. Like, we're going to win."
I think that's why Paul Nuttall wanted to stand, because
He was convinced he would win the
an
by-election.
People used to be very happy and very engaged about going out and voting UKIP. But what this by-election in Stoke showed was that people didn't bother going out to vote for UKIP or Labour or the Lib Dems or anyone.
Yeah,
And
the turnout was
the
appalling.
low turnout shows that people really weren't enthusiastic about UKIP.
Oh, anyone. I mean, I think it was an election just gripped by apathy. And to be fair, like, because the problem was Labour's candidate was pretty trash. Like, it was a pretty poor candidate they put up.
To stand such a pro-Remainer in the most Leave area in the country was an incredibly risky strategy.
And not just that, like he had all those tweets come out about what he was saying about women and things. Like he was the candidate was sort of scraping the bottom of the barrel, I think.
I think he'll probably stop tweeting as much. Now that he's an MP, I think he'll refrain from tweeting his mind.
Yeah. Well, even if Paul Nuttall had been elected, the result probably would have been challenged and made to be rerun because he was clearly breaking electoral rules by.
He claimed to be living at a property he wasn't living at.
Yeah, which you can't do.
And that, can I just say, Michael Crick is still an amazing journalist.
He is, yeah. He's very good.
He was amazing in the 80s, and still now, all these years later, he's still breaking news stories.
Yeah.
I really like Michael Crick.
He's a very good journalist. I think as well, the claims it was interesting. People were claiming to Michael Crick on Twitter saying, "Oh, you can't give away his address now. It's all getting smashed up and threats and so on." Yeah, but Paul Nuttall wanted the address printed on 60,000 ballot papers. Like he gave the address out himself. Copeland. Moving on to the other by-election. Not as good for Labour, has to be said. And of course, naturally, that's been the headlines since the by-election has been Copeland. Understandably, you'd focus on Copeland, not Stoke. It's a much more significant result. What went wrong?
Well, I'm not actually surprised that Labour lost Copeland.
Okay.
Personally, in my own politics, I am very anti-nuclear power. I think we should stop using nuclear power completely and start moving to renewable energy. Now, that doesn't mean we stop nuclear power all in one go, but I think there should be a massive transition away from nuclear power to renewable energy. And I think I'm right in saying that this is Jeremy Corbyn's general view. Jeremy Corbyn's very environmentally friendly, very green, and I think he wants to move away from nuclear power and towards renewable energy, which is better for the environment. And given all of that, I don't think it's that surprising that Labour couldn't maintain Copeland, which has a massive nuclear industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's Labour's saving grace. I think for this by-election is that you can say, oh, it's a local factor, Sellafield. That's why Labour lost. It wasn't to do with anything else. It was just that Corbyn's anti-nuclear. People there are pro-nuclear. What can you do?
There was a lot of. I'm going to go all Trump now. There was a lot of fake news, and lots of people seem to think that if they voted Labour, their Labour MP would close down the nuclear power station. And there were lots of scare stories like that occurred over this.
Well, the candidate was pro-nuclear, wasn't she?
He was. I think I'm correct in saying her husband actually worked in the nuclear power plant.
Yeah.
So none of these rumours were true or substantiated. They were just made up because it would be beneficial to other parties if people thought Labour would close it down.
Yeah, it's just electioneering, isn't it? But it is shocking that an opposition party loses a seat to the government. Like,
it is a tragic defeat.
It's the first time that's happened without a defection since the 60s. Like, which is insanity. Like, it's 50 years since that happened. So yeah, it's just a shame that the Tories majority is back up to what it was before. Cancelled out the Richmond by-election.
Do you think it was a wise move for the Liberal Democrats to stand in Copeland?
Yes.
So you,
Main reason. It's the same reason for both the Stoke and the Copeland by-elections. If Labour had been endorsed by the Lib Dems, that wouldn't have been a positive for them, because then it would have been so easy for the Tories and UKIP to paint Labour as, Remainers. And they're not going to do Article 50. They're supported by the Lib Dems. So I think that the voters who would have voted Liberal, who'd voted Liberal Democrat, wouldn't have voted Labour anyway, because they're disgruntled Remainers.
So you would say that largely the Lib Dem vote was a pro-EU vote?
Yes, I think that's the defining factor in those two by-elections. We got like 2,500 votes in each. It wasn't huge, but I do think that had we stepped aside and endorsed Labour, that wouldn't have been a positive. I think it would have counted against Labour with Brexit voters who they're pursuing, and I don't think those voters would have transferred over to Labour. No,
I think I broadly agree with that.
But that's what I mean about the Progressive Alliance, about working together. It's incredibly specific, select constituencies. It has to be constituencies where the people who vote Lib Dem and the people who vote Labour would be okay voting for each party. In Richmond, that was kind of the case, because people who voted Labour and Liberal were broadly similar in their outlook, being both heavily pro-Remain. So, but in constituencies like Copeland, where it was sort of strongly to leave, people who are going to vote for Lib Dem are not going to vote for Labour necessarily. They're two different types of voters.
And I do think any chance of, if there is any chance of an electoral alliance, I do think it would make sense to have it post-Brexit. Because at the moment, there's a left-right dividing line, there's a liberal-conservative dividing line, and there's also a Remain-Leave dividing line.
Yeah.
There's so many different ways that people can be divided and different in their politics that I don't think an electoral alliance would work any time until Brexit is actually initiated.
No, I don't. I think that's true. I think what we have seen there's been quite a lot of. It's been at local levels. There's been cooperation between Lib Dems and Greens, not including Labour, because there's the Greens and the Lib Dems are very close on Brexit policy, on the environment, on education. They're very similar. So in some areas there's been some cooperation there. I think with Labour it's a different kettle of fish, because the voters the Lib Dems and the Greens are targeting at the moment are quite similar. The voters that Labour need to appeal to are much broader, so it's much more difficult for Labour, the Lib Dems, the Greens to be able to adopt a common policy platform, because Labour need to and are trying to appeal to a different kind of voter that doesn't want those policy platforms.
The Greens and the Lib Dems are not parties of government. They are parties. They're parties trying to gain. They're not going to win a majority. Put it that way.
Well, now it's Labour, though. To be fair,
yeah,
not without Scotland. I mean, even if you had a really good leader at the moment, it would be so difficult to get a majority, because without those 50 seats from Scotland, you have to get all those votes from England, and they're just not there for Labour. Without Blair, without a Blair-style landslide, so difficult to get a majority in England.
Even the Blair-style landslide included quite a lot of Scotland.
Well, yeah, Labour won 41 seats there in 2010.
Yes, yeah.
So, for example, there was that vote share in 2010, which got 255. If you'd had that again, that you'd be down to 200, which is roughly where probably Corbyn will be, even if not lower. Without Scotland, Labour won't win a majority. I don't want to say ever, but without another Blair-style landslide, you won't know. Which is why I think Labour have to one, get on board with electoral reform. That is the most crucial issue that Labour need to realise they have to get on board with, because you're not going to win a majority again.
Yeah,
they need to acknowledge that you're not going to get a majority. It's better if we have a better voting system, so that we can have a progressive majority. So we can have Greens, SNP, Lib Dems, Labour, SDLP and whoever else can together have a majority in Parliament so that we can have progressive policies put in that aren't Conservative and UKIP.
And policies that broadly reflect the nation as a whole, better than what first past the post allows. Because is it 36 or 37% of people actually voted Tory?
36.9, something like that.
36.9 voted Tory, and now there's a Tory majority.
Yeah.
I'm glad that we have now a Labour leader who has, for basically his entire political career, advocated the need for a fairer voting system.
Has he?
So hopefully we will see, certainly in our lifetimes.
I didn't know that Corbyn was pro-electoral reform.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, he's always supported reforming democracy in all sorts.
Labour need to get a move on and get on board with it, because the party's not. It's dragging its feet still. Certainly before the next election.
The leader supports electoral reform. The question is, how many of the MPs support?
Yeah, there are too many Labour MPs and in some cases Labour members who are caught up in this whole. Well, yeah, but it benefits us. Like when we can get a majority, we can get into government. They haven't seemed to realise that Scotland isn't coming back anytime soon, and you're not winning a majority without Scotland. So it's far better to have reform.
If I'm not mistaken, the majority of what people would call the Labour left MPs are all in support of, certainly the majority supports having electoral reform, just because our current democracy doesn't reflect the view of the British people.
And that, to me, is the central reason why we have so many problems with politics, why people don't trust politicians, why we have poisonous, toxic public debate, is because Parliament hasn't represented voters for decades. The views of the voters, the views of the public are not reflected in Parliament. For example, you've got like the Green MPs. There should be 20 or so Green MPs in Parliament pushing forward their Green view. There should be lots of UKIP MPs, for example. And representative democracy only works if it's representative, and ours isn't, and hasn't been for a long time. Okay, I think we'll leave the podcast here then. Thank you very much for listening. If you haven't enjoyed the podcast this week, please do leave a like, comment, subscribe. If you didn't like it, leave a dislike. And if you would like to support us more in any kind of financial way, the link to our Patreon is in the description below. And we will be back again in 2 weeks' time, hopefully with our third host. So we'll see you then. Thanks for listening.